Thank you for joining me here for this presentation. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Dan. I'm the Customer Learning and Development Consultant here at RightCapital, and I'm excited to be here with you today for this presentation of Overview of the Planning Modules Part 2. So this webinar is one that we run every other week here at RightCapital. We alternate every Wednesday between Overview of the Planning Modules Part 1 and Part 2. And these RightCapital 101 webinars are where we take some time to review all of the different planning modules that you'll find within your client plans in RightCapital. So regardless of whether you're brand new to the system or maybe you're a RightCapital veteran looking for a refresher, there will certainly be something here for everyone today. In part 2, in particular today, we'll be focusing on a handful of specific planning modules. These are going to be modules that you might not use with every single client, but depending on the main client demographic that you work with or the specific services that you offer, these modules will certainly provide a substantial amount of value if and when they're called for. So before we dive in today, let's take a quick look over our agenda. The modules we're going to be touching on today are the insurance module, the education module, and the estate module, as well as everything located within the More menu, which is mainly the debt module, student loan module, and stock plans module. So those areas are going to be our main focus today. We're going to look over each one of those modules, dive into all the subtabs and all the features that you can find within each one. We'll, of course, also touch on some key visuals and how you can leverage those, as well as just general tips and best practices to keep in the back of your mind as you're using these tools with your clients. We'll wrap things up today by highlighting some Help Center resources that you're always welcome to utilize. And for those of you that might be new, that might be attending your first RightCapital webinar here today, I do want to let you know as I'm switching my screen here that these webinars also are interactive. And while I do certainly have plenty of prepared content for you today, I would also like to hear from you. So if you have any questions at all as we're making our way through the presentation, feel free to write in. You should find a questions field or a Q&A field in the Zoom control panel on your screen. I will be sticking around at the end of the presentation today to answer as many of your questions as I can. So like I said, feel free to write in. I'm here to help however I can. All right. So here we are in our case study for today. This may look familiar if you attended yesterday's presentation, Creating Your First Plan. This is a joint plan for Sadie and Sam Green. For those of you that weren't with us yesterday, I do want to quickly start things off by taking a brief look at the profile area. And in particular, I really just want to highlight the fact that this is a plan where we've already completed the initial data entry process. So we already walked through the steps of entering all of that client's accounts, assets, and liabilities. We've entered all of their financial goals, all of their income, account contributions, expenses, and so on. And the reason I say this up front is because for our purposes today, when it comes to the planning modules, it is actually a requirement to complete that initial data entry process before unlocking the rest of the modules that you see on my screen here today. So I just wanted to quickly mention that you will need to complete that initial 6 steps of data entry before you can use something like the insurance module or the education module or so on. But I always like to make sure to point out, if you need to access one of these modules, you can always skip some information, skip some steps during that initial data entry process, because you can always circle back to those areas within the profile tab of a plan. So if you need to skip something to utilize one of the planning modules in a meeting with a new client or even a prospect, feel free to do so. You can always circle back at a later date and fill out the rest of that information. So with that being said, for this plan today, we have all of our baseline information entered here, and we can start to utilize the rest of our planning modules. I do want to take a quick look at the retirement analysis module here as well before we dive into the insurance module for today. This is a module that's covered a bit more thoroughly in overview of the planning modules part 1, but for those of you that might be attending this presentation first, there are a couple of important foundational concepts here in the retirement section that I do want to touch on quickly before we dive into the rest of our planning modules for today. So the retirement analysis is, of course, where we find the probability of success and the median ending portfolio value for both the proposed and current plans for a client. And the main thing I want to highlight here is just the differences between current and proposed, as well as the action items at the bottom of this page. So when you first create a new client plan in RightCapital, the current plan is always going to be based on that data entry that you did up front, all the information that's entered into the profile area. So that directly translates into the current plan. And this is always a reflection of the client's current picture, their current financial situation. The proposed plan, on the other hand, is where you have an opportunity to curate some changes or proposals using the action items at the bottom of this page. And this is really going to be relevant for our purposes here today. The proposed plan will use the current plan as a baseline, but as you start making changes and implementing specific strategies, those will become a factor in your proposed plan, and you can see the impact of those. So for our purposes here today, some of the modules that we're going to look at do correspond with specific strategies here in the action items. In particular, the education module has a specific strategy tied to it, as well as the debt module, the student loan module, and the stock plans module. So we'll be circling back to this page here and there throughout the presentation today, just to touch on those strategies a bit more in depth. But the idea here is that these are standalone modules that can be used to curate a specific strategy for, that specific element of the plan. And then if you decide you want to proceed with that, you can actually import that strategy into their retirement proposal here in the retirement analysis to factor that into their plan as a whole. So you can use these tools standalone if you'd like. You can also bake those strategies into their bigger picture here in the retirement section. So just wanted to clarify that first and foremost before diving into the rest of the modules today. That being said, we are going to touch next on the insurance module. And for those of you that might be familiar already with the retirement section to a degree, the insurance module is actually quite similar in the way that it functions. I sort of like to consider this a companion piece to the retirement analysis in a lot of ways. And in terms of functionality, like I mentioned, very similar setup here. We have our summary visuals at the top. We have our action items at the bottom where we can manipulate those variables and model different what if scenarios. The main difference, of course, between the retirement section and something like the life insurance analysis here is that this is really running a very specific set of what if scenarios, all focused on different types of insurance. So I will spend most of my time here talking about the life insurance analysis. This is the most comprehensive tool within this module, but we will touch on the rest of these as well, and they all function in generally a similar way. So starting with life insurance, what we have here, like I said, is a very specific set of side-by-side what-if scenarios. We're actually running two different scenarios here. And in each of these scenarios, what we're looking at is if one client or the other were to pass away next year, at the beginning of next year, how much would the surviving client need in terms of a life insurance payout, a death benefit, in order to make it to the end of their plan without ever running out of money? So at a high level, that's what we see here. The protection need, this life insurance need, is also going to be reflected in the chart up top. I always like to clarify when it comes to the protection need that this is the bare minimum death benefit that would be necessary in order to make sure that the client makes it to the very end of their plan with at least $1 left in their, to their name, in their bank account. So it is the bare minimum. Always like to highlight that first and foremost. Of course, this is a comprehensive cash flow based tool, just like the retirement section. So this isn't just a simple income replacement calculator. This is running a full set of cash flow projections, factoring in all of the same variables, all of the same inputs that the retirement section is using. Everything entered into the profile is feeding into this tool as well. And just like the retirement section, the action items here are where we can curate the specific inputs, the specific variables that we want to see within each of these projections. And that is, of course, going to have an impact on the protection need that's being calculated for each client. So I really do like to highlight the general importance of the action items in this module in particular. A lot of the time rather, when information is entered into the profile, a lot of the time that's with the intention of each client making it to the end of the plan. But when it comes to a scenario like this where, one client or the other is passing away unexpectedly, we all know that a lot of these variables, financial goals, income, expenses, would likely change potentially to an extreme degree. So it is important, I would say, to review the action items here to make sure that the specifics in terms of income, expenses, goals, and savings are dialed into your liking before we start really looking at the protection need we see for each client. And just to demonstrate, making changes to any of these variables will change the protection need. So, if a client were to pass away, maybe we would reevaluate some of our expenses and goals. Or maybe we would want to play it safe and make an assumption that expenses are going to be a bit higher than we've anticipated. Maybe we'll reduce the cost of some of our vacation goals that we're planning for. Maybe we're going to have some of the children in this plan take out some loans to help pay their way through college. So, we can make adjustments to some of these items. Click the refresh button in the lower right, and that's going to recalculate the protection need to factor in those changes we made. So as a result of those handful of changes I just made, we see a decrease here in the protection need if Sam were to pass away next year. So that's the general idea here. Just like the retirement section, if you're looking to make an adjustment to a specific profile input, a specific variable, and maybe you don't see it listed here, remember that you can always click the edit button in the lower right. This is going to open a list of every single input, every profile card across all the different areas of the data entry. So you can find items you need, check those off on this list, and you'll be able to manipulate those within the action item display. All right. So that's the general overview of how this tool functions. I do want to touch quickly on the fact that in addition to these, summary visuals, which stack up the protection need against any current or proposed coverage, which we can see here by dial in some proposed insurance, there are some additional tabs here with some additional visuals to keep in mind. So these client specific tabs are going to provide a bit closer of a look at each scenario for, if Sadie were to pass away, as well as if Sam were to pass away. And we get a sense of what income shortage might occur in that scenario, roughly when that's going to occur and for how much. So this can be a helpful visual as well. There is also a details tab here where we can actually find the cash flows, all the granular nitty gritty details of what's happening in both of these what if scenarios. So here's where we can actually dive into these a little bit and start to understand, how are we arriving at a certain protection need? What are the mechanics of the cash inflows and cash outflows for each of our scenarios? What are the ending account balances looking like over the course of one or both of these what if scenarios? So these can be really enlightening, especially in terms of potentially identifying, when a client might be running out of assets, in one or both of these simulations. All right. So, like I said, most of these tabs in the insurance module do function in a very similar way to the life insurance tool. So, I won't spend quite as much time on the rest of these. But just to touch on each of them, the disability module is similar to the life insurance analysis, also running a very specific what if scenario here. Of course, in this case, we're looking at what would happen if one client or the other were to become disabled tomorrow. So that's the specific what if scenario that's being run in this tool. Other than that, the functionality is quite similar. We have the ability to add and edit any of those same action items that we saw back in the life insurance to really fine tune the details of each of these scenarios. And just like before, we can propose additional coverage, show clients, how far that would get us in terms of covering some of that lost income due to that disability event. And we have some of the same tabs here in terms of the client-specific tabs, showing us that income coverage and our cash flows here in the details tab. So very similar setup here with disability. If I haven't mentioned it yet, I do want to quickly make sure to say, in all of these insurance tabs, if clients have current insurance, if they have an existing policy, in this case, a disability policy, entered into the net worth area of their profile, that will be factored into the life insurance or disability insurance module as well. And we'll see that reflected in these charts in a darker blue color here as current coverage. So that's going to apply for all of the insurance modules here. We will see that current coverage factored into these projections. Touching next on long-term care, this is a tool that, of course, looks at long-term care insurance and the impact that that can have. This one does function a little differently, so I do want to quickly just explain mostly what we're seeing here with this chart. So rather than a side-by-side like we saw before in those other modules, this one is looking at the final 10 years of the plan as a whole. And what we really see here is the client's overall invested assets without long-term care expenses in blue and with long-term care expenses in purple. So we can see those side by side, and ultimately we can see a bit more clearly, a bit more visually, the impact that long-term care costs can have on a client's assets near the end of their life. So, you know, we can get a sense of when those long-term care costs are going to begin, how much those are going to be, and how much those might eat into the client's assets and the projections. Just like our other modules, we then have the ability to propose some additional long-term care coverage. So if I quickly dial in some rough parameters here, we'll be able to see in green how much long-term care coverage might be able to mitigate in terms of, the negative impacts potentially of those long-term care costs. So we can see here that, as a result of that daily coverage I just proposed, we're increasing ending assets by about $500,000 for these clients. So this is another tool we can use for those clients that might be a little bit concerned about the impact of long-term care costs, especially near the end of their plan. Last but not least, we have property and casualty. This area provides us with a more simplified version of some of those other tools that we looked at, specifically focusing on homeowners insurance, auto insurance, and umbrella insurance. So not quite as comprehensive as those other tools here, but if you find yourself needing to do a quick analysis of a client's current coverage and propose some additional coverage for any of these other types of insurance, you do have access to these modules and these visuals here as well. All right. So that does cover it for the insurance module in Right Capital. This is a module that is separate from the retirement section. So I know I mentioned before that some modules that we're going to look at today do tie back into the retirement analysis. The insurance section does not tie back into the retirement projections. That's why I described it up top as more of a companion piece. These exist side by side. You can certainly use both with a client if you'd like, but more often than not, depending on your needs and depending on your focus, I find advisors typically use one or the other, either for those more holistic retirement projections or for that more focused insurance analysis. All right. So moving on to our next module here, we're going to be touching on the education module. This is one that does tie back into the retirement projections. So we're going to get a little taste of that in just a bit here. But before I get ahead of myself, the education module, the education funding analysis in Right Capital is used for clients that either are planning to go back to school themselves or have children or grandchildren that they're planning to put through school to some extent. So this area will look at any individuals in the plan that have education goals entered. So in this case, I have two children here, Wally and Nora. Each of these children has a college goal entered back in the goals area of the profile. And this area pulls in that information, and we can see the future projected education costs for each individual. So these are the inflated values, cumulative, as well as for each individual year for each student within the plan. And in addition to these visuals, we can also take a look at curating a education funding proposal for these clients. So depending on the client's goals and how much of each child's education goal they plan to fund, we can dial in specific strategies to achieve that percentage of funding for each child. And there are a lot of different variables that we're able to manipulate here in this tool. Of course, starting at the top here, we can adjust the cost of the education goals themselves. So we can see the original annual education costs as it's entered into those goal cards. But we can also enter things like scholarships we might expect, student borrowing that we might be planning for, and we can see the impact that that will have on the annual net cost for that student. So that's the first thing we're able to manipulate here. If you do have clients that are planning to maybe only partially fund their child's education, maybe they're going to have, set aside the first year or two to fund and then have that child or grandchild take out loans to, pay for the rest of that 4-year experience. That's when you might want to use student borrowing to indicate that sort of thing here. Of course, in addition to the actual costs being able to be manipulated, we can also play around with 529 savings and asset allocation. So, if there are any existing 529 assets in the plan, either a 529 account with a current balance or 529 savings cards, contributions that are being made either by the clients themselves or potentially an outside individual like we see here. Both of those items will be pulled into this tool. We can play around with the different contribution amounts. We can propose additional contributions either as a lump sum or on an annual basis. So we can play around with those 529 savings. We can also test the impact of different asset allocations for the 529 plans for each student. So, maybe we don't want to stick with the way those 529s are currently allocated in the plan. Maybe we want to see the impact that a different model portfolio, a different asset allocation would have on the growth of those 529 assets over time. So that's an option for us. And then ultimately the funding sources as well as the final option here, which allows us to say, what assets do we actually want to use to fund these education goals? Do we want to use just the 529 assets and nothing else? Do we want to use the 529s first and then fund the rest with taxable assets? Do we want to throw Roth assets in there? So on and so forth. So we can mix and match different funding sources and all of our other variables here to eventually arrive at the goal coverage that we're looking for that individual. And we can do this for each student separately. So you're able to plan for, you know, each child's college goal in a different way if need be. Just like the insurance module that we looked at before, this module does also have a details tab, which provides us with some of those cash flow tables. So here we can actually see again the mechanics of what's happening for our proposal. At this point, I do always like to point out just a pro tip for everyone. The cash flow details that are being used by the education module here are tied to the proposed plan in the retirement analysis area. So something important to keep in mind, a common question that I tend to see is, if we're proposing some additional 529 contributions and maybe those aren't happening, and maybe we're taking a look at the 529 savings here that are happening, and maybe, the contributions that we've indicated here in the action items, for whatever reason, aren't happening here in the cash flows. The cause of that might be the plan itself not having available assets to make those contributions. So, something to keep in mind, the education module does look to the cash flow details of the proposed plan in the retirement section to determine how much income is actually available for something like additional 529 contributions. So if you were to, theoretically make a lump sum 529 contribution of, let's say $100,000, and maybe in year one of our plan, we don't actually have an extra $100,000 to use based on everything that's happening on our proposal, those savings might not occur to the full extent that we've entered them. So just something to keep in mind. It does look at the proposed plan with all of your factored changes, everything that's entered with the action items. So something to double check if you do experience that, if you aren't seeing some of those items occurring in the cash flows here. Other than that, everything that we see here is relatively straightforward in our cash flow area. We can see the education cost summary, the actual dollar amount of those college goals each year, the net cost, 529 funding, and any other funding that might be occurring. We can view that for each client or for each student rather here within the plan. And then of course the 529 summaries as well, which we looked at a moment ago. We can see the beginning and ending balances for those, the portfolio return being generated each year within that 529 plan, as well as contributions and ultimately withdrawals as well. So lots of great details here. The final piece of the puzzle when it comes to the education module is Once we've dialed in a proposal here that we like, we reviewed it with the clients, we decide that we want to proceed with this. This is something that we can then implement back within the retirement analysis area. I mentioned this briefly before, but within the action items at the bottom of this page here, we can isolate the education strategy item, swap this from current strategy to education proposal. And then once we click refresh in the lower right, it's going to rerun the calculations, crunch all the numbers, and actually import that education proposal into the proposed plan. So now we'll be able to see on the left here the impact of that on the plan as a whole. So we'll see changes to the probability of success, changes to the median ending portfolio value, and also if we were to take a look at the cash flows here for our proposed plan, we would see changes to the cash flow details as well. So that's sort of the final piece as it relates to the education module and creating those education funding proposals. All right. So that's two modules down. We've covered insurance and education here today. The next module that we're going to dive into is the estate module. So this is a module that has a couple different pieces. We're going to start by looking at the checklist and the beneficiary tab. These are standalone tools that are simple in nature, simple in functionality, but can be quite powerful, especially for clients that might be in the earlier stages of putting together an estate plan. And then we also have the estate analysis, which is really the heart and soul of this tool. We can actually see the future looking projections, the flow of assets past the end of each client's life. So before I get ahead of myself here, let's start by reviewing the checklist and the beneficiary tab. So these tools function in very much the same way. They are both essentially lists, checklists that we can use to track some important estate planning tasks. This is something we can walk through with clients to help make sure that all of these important documents have been created. We can list all of the important individuals for each of these documents. So for something like the will, we can name the executor, guardian. We can indicate when these documents were last updated. And ultimately, we can track and store all of this information within the context of a living, breathing financial plan. So the thing that I always like to say here is that if you do have some individuals who are in the process of putting this together, and maybe they're prone to maybe writing this information down on a piece of paper or in a notebook, and then potentially losing said piece of paper when they actually need to retrieve that information. We don't want that to happen. So it can be helpful having this information stored somewhere like their Right Capital financial plan, so that it's tracked, stored, and saved somewhere where we can always access it going forward and we won't lose that potentially. So, similarly to the checklist module, we have the beneficiaries tab, which is where we can track the primary and contingent beneficiaries for all of the different accounts and assets within our plan. I always like to mention just a pro tip for everyone for this works for both of these modules, checklist and beneficiary. These will give you some options to choose from that, are, of course, individuals within the plan can be selected, charity, trust, all children and grandchildren. But if you ever need to indicate an individual that is outside of the plan, you can always use the custom option. And this is going to let you type in whatever you would like. So this can be helpful if you need to do something like I've done here, maybe split an account between two different individuals. You can indicate those percentages for each individual, or you can simply enter the name of an individual that is not a participant in the plan. So definitely keep that custom option in the back of your mind there. This is also a place where I like to highlight the fact that utilizing the notes function at the bottom of some of these modules can be a really helpful way to help keep clients on track and to help keep yourself on track as well in terms of where clients are at in the process of putting together something like an estate plan. So this is something that you can do across all the different planning modules in Right Capital. Even the retirement section, the insurance, education modules will allow you to leave notes at the bottom here. All you need to do is click the notes area and you can add notes. But for something like estate planning in particular, this can be really helpful. You can list next steps for clients. You can even include hyperlinks here where clients can find and download some of those blank templates that they might need for some of these documents. So that can be really helpful to include this information for clients here. So I always like to highlight the notes area. We will be circling back to notes in just a little bit here once we get to the More menu. All right, moving on, I do want to touch next on the Estate Analysis tab. So the checklist and beneficiary tabs, as I mentioned, these are sort of a separate piece here, and they're really more categorical in nature, used for tracking and storing some of this information. The Estate Analysis tab, on the other hand, is an extension of the retirement analysis. The main difference, of course, being that the retirement analysis is really just looking at the client's plan during their lifetimes. And we're going to start today, and that plan is going to extend through whatever planning horizon you've entered for each client. The estate analysis, on the other hand, is where we can actually see past the end of those planning horizons and take a look at the flow of assets from one client to the next, depending on who's passing away first, and ultimately from the second client to the client's heirs, or potentially to charity as well. So what we have here first is the estate flowchart. This is an interactive visual that we can walk through with clients to help them better understand what they can expect in terms of, you know, passing down these assets from one client to the other and then to their heirs. So in case you aren't aware, you can hover your mouse over some of these tiles. If you see these hop a little bit as you hover your mouse over them, that indicates that you can click into those tiles for a more detailed breakdown. So if we want to get a better sense of what assets make up Sadie's gross estate, we can click into that tile, see the breakdown of assets, real estate, investments, other assets, and so on. So we can better explain how we're arriving at that figure. Similarly, this is where we can also zero in a little bit more on taxes and fees, things like probate, funeral expenses, but also for those of you that might have clients in sort of the higher net worth echelon, this is where we can identify if they can expect to be hit with any estate taxes, either at a federal or state level. So something I do want to mention here, especially as it relates to estate taxes, RightCapital does use future dollars. So both the dollar amounts that we see here, as well as the actual threshold itself, that estate exemption threshold, both of those will be inflated. So something to keep in mind. That estate exemption threshold increases based on your tax inflation rate, which is something that you can view and update potentially within the settings of a plan. But the dollar values we see on this page as well in terms of the gross estates are also future dollars. So something to keep in mind as well. I do want to also mention in general, but specific to maybe something like state level estate taxes, this module, the estate planning module, is looking at the proposed plan, just like the education module. So the reason that's relevant for something like state estate taxes is if you do have something like a primary home relocation occurring, if the clients are moving from whatever state they live in today to a different state in retirement, if that's been modeled as a part of their proposed plan here in the retirement analysis area, that is what will be picked up by the estate module. So if you have a primary home relocation entered here, if you have the clients moving from one state to another, do keep in mind that whatever state they're moving to is what's going to be looked at when it comes to state level estate taxes. And you can find a list in our help center actually of the states that even have state level estate taxes. So feel free to take a look at our help center there for a little bit more information on that. Moving on, I do want to quickly just point out that you can use the action items here to make adjustments to the estate analysis, just like we saw in some of our other modules. If you want to play around with different planning horizons and see the impact of clients passing away at different times and what that will do to all the dollar values we see here, you can certainly do so. You can play around with the funeral expenses, the probate percentage. All those adjustments will have real-time impact on the dollar values in the flowchart. Last but not least, I do want to mention that you can also use this area to propose trust strategies. And again, immediately see the impact on the analysis here. So this is a way for us to say, what are things going to look like if we take assets out of the client's taxable estate and specify a certain dollar value here, move those taxable assets out of the taxable estate into something like, in this case, a credit shelter trust at a certain period of time. So you can enter that dollar value, enter the year you want that to occur, Depending on the type of trust, you might also be able to add an income stream with a term, start date, and income amount. So we can actually model those trusts paying out income to the clients as well. And then we can see the impact that that could potentially have on the client's estate analysis. We'll see that dollar value moved outside of the taxable estate. We can take a look at that proposed trust here in the out of estate section, and we can see what's going to the client's heirs, what's going to charity potentially. So lots of value you can glean from that as well. I already have one added here, but if you're looking to add a new trust strategy from scratch, do know that you can do so by clicking the edit button in the lower right here. There is an option to, in addition to adding and removing specific action items, you can also add a new trust. And this is where we can find a list of all of the supported trust types in RightCapital. So if you want to propose a different type of trust, feel free to take a look through the list here. And like I said, those inputs will vary slightly depending on the type of trust that you select. If you have added a trust here, that's potentially grounds to maybe utilize some of the other modules here, or tabs rather, besides just the flow chart. The comparison tab is where we can actually see the impact of something like a proposed trust. We can see any changes to the dollar amount that heirs will receive, any impact to taxes and fees, uh, potentially charity if your clients are have some more philanthropic goals in their lifetime. There's also a trust tab that will appear if you've added a proposed trust where we can again see some of the cash flow details here. So I have this trust being funded in 2061. So we can see that balance. We can see the portfolio return, taxes and fees, and that income distribution that I entered. We can see that throughout the duration of the plan. So that can be valuable as well. And then the last tab here is the details tab, which is sort of an alternative view to the flowchart tab. So while it can certainly be useful to have that interactive visual and click into those tiles in order, if you're just looking to see everything on one page in more of a traditional balance sheet style format here, the details tab is where we can view all of this on one page. Both clients' estates, both gross and net, all of the out of estate assets, and ultimately total to heirs and total to charity as well. All right. So we are getting close to the end of the presentation today, folks. We've already touched on 3 of the modules that we're going to cover today. We're going to dive into the last section in just a minute here, but I do want to take a quick breather and just make sure I mention that the rest of these modules that we're not touching on today will be touched on next Wednesday in Overview of the Planning Modules Part 1. So the dashboard module, the investment module, the retirement section, as well as the tax module are all going to be touched on next Wednesday. So if you're curious to dive a little bit deeper into the other half of the planning modules, feel free to sign up for, overview of the planning modules part 1. I'll point out where you can find that link in just a little bit here once we cover the next few modules here. All right. So diving into the last area for our presentation here today, I want to make sure to highlight the More module, which is this little 3 dots icon here between the profile and the vault. So it is relatively easy to overlook this. Some of these modules are a bit tucked away here, but there are some very valuable modules to be found here. So definitely don't forget that these modules are here in the More menu. And you can utilize these with all of your clients depending on your needs for a specific household. So here's where we can find some really powerful standalone tools for things like debt management, student loan management, and stock plan management. Each of these modules has a corresponding strategy back in the retirement section, so we can dial in those strategies here and then factor those into the proposal in the retirement section. In addition to these 3 modules, there's also a human life value calculator here, as well as a notes area. So we're going to quickly review these 3 modules first, tie those back into the retirement section, and then wrap things up by touching on calculator and notes. Starting with our debt module. If you have clients who might have unfortunately accumulated a good amount of debt in their lifetime, this can be a really great way to show the value of essentially eliminating that debt using some specific debt reduction strategies. So here is where we can show clients the impact of different payment priorities. Things like snowball and avalanche strategies can be modeled here. So that's one piece of the puzzle. We can also model, potentially taking some of that available cash flow and shifting that towards making additional monthly payments towards these loans. So that's the other piece of the proposed payment strategy. And then in terms of the individual loans within the plan, these are all the loans feeding in from the net worth section of the profile. We can pick and choose here which loans we actually want to include in this proposed strategy. So in this case, I've chosen to include all of the loans here except for Sam's Federal Direct student loan. I have this one set aside, and we're going to do something separate with that in just a bit here in the student loan module. But we can pick and choose here which modules we want to include. Ultimately, with everything dialed in, we can click refresh in the lower right, and then we can show clients using an easy to understand visual here how much they'll save long term in terms of interest, and importantly, how much sooner they'll be debt free as a result of our proposed strategy compared to their current strategy. So that's the general idea here with the debt management tool. There's a couple other tabs to be aware of. The payment tab is going to show us just a breakdown of some of the important information related to all of the loans in this plan. So we can see balances and interest rates here, minimum and current payment amounts side by side with proposed payment amounts stemming from your proposed strategy. And then just like some of our other modules we've looked at today, the details tab is where we can find that cash flow breakdown, those amortization schedules for every loan that we're looking at here on both an annual basis as well as a monthly basis. So we can really dive into the nitty gritty of, those proposed payment schedules based on our proposed strategy. Hopefully I still have the retirement analysis open here. So the retirement analysis, as I mentioned, we can use to take that debt strategy we've modeled and pull that in to the proposed plan here. Make that a part of their overall retirement plan here, the proposed plan on the left, and make sure that's being factored into the plan. So if we dial something in here, review it with the clients and they like it and want to proceed with it, we can, in just a few clicks, make sure that that's being factored into their proposed plan. In a similar vein, we also have a student loan management tool. And this tool, in terms of functionality, pretty much identical to the debt module. Of course, the main difference being we're focusing specifically on student loans here and some of the more specific strategies at our disposal when it comes to student loans specifically. So just like the debt management tool, the action items are where we can dial in those proposed strategies. We see things separated out here by client and co-client. So in this plan, Sam is the only one that has student loans. So we're focusing just on the right side here. And I really haven't done anything all that complicated in this example. All I've done is take Sam's federal loans and swap him over from the standard 10-year payment plan to the SAVE plan, that income-driven repayment plan. There are a couple other things you can do here besides modeling those income-driven repayment plan options. You can also model, as you see here, a refinance if you'd like. You can model a loan consolidation, taking multiple loans and consolidating those into a single federal consolidation loan. We can also model for clients that might either be currently working towards it or thinking of working in the public sector towards PSLF, public service loan forgiveness. So that's something that we can model as a strategy here as well. So all those things considered, we can model our proposal here, and we have a similar breakdown in the rest of this module. We can see the value of our proposal here in the summary tab, total savings in terms of interest, any loan balance that might be forgiven as a result of our strategy. We can see the loans tab, again, for that breakdown of the student loans, the balances and interest rates. You can also quickly identify here what strategies a certain loan might be eligible for based on the type of loan that it is. So that can be an easy way to quickly and easily identify what strategies clients might want to take a look at depending on the types of loans that they have. The strategy tab is more of a visual for clients. If you find that your clients are maybe struggling a little bit to understand why they might want to choose certain forgiveness options or income driven repayment options, This can be a helpful way to sort of walk them through step by step. Here's the plan. Here's why we're doing what we're doing. In this case, working in the private sector, prioritizing lower monthly payments. So we're going to be placing you on an income-driven payment plan with eventual loan forgiveness if that's still outstanding after the end of that term. So we can sort of walk through step by step depending on the specific proposal that we've modeled. Again, we have that details tab for that cash flow breakdown. Just like the debt module, we can view annual and monthly breakdowns here. We've already walked through it a couple times here today, so I won't dwell on it too much, but just like the debt proposal, back in the retirement section, you will find that student loan strategy. You can take that income-driven repayment plan or PSLF or whatever you've modeled there, factor that into their overall proposed plan. The final of the three standalone planning tools here is the stock plans module. So I do actually have some stock plans on deck here that I can re-include so that we can take a quick look at this. So something to note here, if your clients don't have any stock plans, of course, there's no need to use that module. You won't see any information populate there. But if you do have clients with equity compensation like RSUs, ISOs, NQOs, so on, that's a situation where we can then use the stock plans module. And in particular, this is a helpful tool for people that maybe aren't quite sure what they should really be doing with all these stock grants they're receiving, especially if maybe they're sitting on those when they shouldn't be, letting those accumulate when in reality they'd be better off, exercising and liquidating those options a bit sooner. So this module is great for those clients. We can take a look firstly at what's the current situation? What is the total value of all the grants that we've received as of today? What percentage of those are vested versus unvested? At what point in time are we going to be fully vested based on all those grants we've received? So we can look at a summary of the client's existing grants. We can also zero in on some more specific information here in the grants tab if we really want to take a look at some of the nitty gritty details here in terms of each individual grant and what's been vested, what's being held, what's exercised, and so on. And then the final piece here within the analysis tab, just like our debt module and our student loan module, is to dial in a proposed strategy for this stock plan. So we can play around with all the details here in terms of when should we exercise these grants? When should we start liquidating some of these grants? In this example, I have things being liquidated a year after exercise to take advantage of that long-term capital gains treatment. So it's just one strategy you can implement here. You can even choose to do something like a cashless exercise or an 83B election. Maybe you have clients with grants that are eligible for those strategies, but maybe they're just not aware that those are something they should be doing potentially, something that can provide value in terms of saving on taxes and things like that. So lots of value here in terms of being able to model all these different strategies for these stock grants. And at the end of the day, we can show clients the value of our proposed strategy compared to their current. And of course, just like our other modules, we can view the cash flow details here in terms of summary by shares, summary by value. So we can see both the number of shares and dollar value here, and the actual cash flow breakdown in terms of cost of exercise, shares being sold, sale proceeds, and net cash flows. Just to quickly mention it, this is another module where back in the retirement section, you can turn that on within the projections. For this one in particular, I do believe that this is not one of the action items that's included here by default. So if you're looking for the stock plan strategy and you don't see it listed here, you may just need to click the edit button in the lower right and then find that item in the strategies column here on the right. It might be unchecked by default. So you might just need to check this box, click save here to add that to the action item display. And then just like our other tools, we can turn on that proposal, click refresh, and then see the impact on the client's plan as a whole. All right, nearly there, folks. I do just want to quickly mention these last two modules. These are pretty simple tools, so this should only take a minute or two here. And then we can dive into the Q&A and I can start answering some of your questions to round out the presentation today. Firstly, the calculator. This is RightCapital's Human Life Value Calculator. Like I mentioned, this is a simple tool, but this can provide a lot of value as a way to quickly figure out, some insurance coverage information. And this is most often used in my experience with new clients or prospects. This can sort of be seen as a precursor to the insurance module, where we can get a quick sense of what coverage amount a client might need to replace that lost income if they were to pass away. The main difference here is that this is greatly simplified. If you're working with a new client or a prospect, maybe you don't have the time or the information to enter all of that information into their profile, create a full cash flow based plan for a client to use something like the life insurance module. The calculator can be a quick way to, get an estimate without all that other information. This is simply going to ask, what's the client's salary? What's their annual income? How long is it going to be until they retire? And then you can even choose to factor in a discount rate and a tax rate to impact that calculation. And at the end of the day, it's going to show us a dollar amount here in terms of, a rough estimate in terms of life insurance coverage to make up for that lost income. It's a pretty simple tool, but can certainly provide a lot of value for those prospects and new clients. Last but not least, we have the notes tab. And I did touch on notes a little bit in the estate module. The notes in RightCapital are, you can enter notes across the different planning modules. Almost every tab, every module in RightCapital allows you to leave notes either for your eyes only or to be shared with clients. So you can do something like, list long form recommendations. You maybe write out some written recommendations for clients at the bottom of the retirement analysis area. That's one of the common examples that I tend to see when working with advisors. But sometimes it can be tricky to remember where you left a certain note. So the Notes tab summarizes all the plan notes. Every note you've left across every section of the plan will all be consolidated here. It'll show you exactly where you left that note so you can easily find and identify each of those notes. And you can even edit those notes right here in the Notes tab so you don't have to actually click back into that module. So it's just a quick way to organize and update your notes within the plan. There is also an advisor notes area. If you want to take notes for your eyes only and just leave maybe notes from client meetings or, after presentations, quickly just jot down some notes for yourself and have those stored within the plan. This is a place where you can create private notes and clients won't see these. These are for your eyes only. It can be a quick way to leave notes for yourself.